Chapter 5 The Future of Battle. The Moving Battlefield. The psalm brings the story of the development of battle as a human experience and human ordeal into our own times, those of industrial economies, mass electorates, and conscript armies. This is true even though the psalm may seem, to a late 20th century way of thinking, an old-fashioned battle, more of a part with, say, Gettysburg, than with Kursk or Alamein or the Ardennes or Sinai, and this chiefly because of the absence from the field of any fighting vehicle, and from the skies above it of ground attack aircraft. But to dwell on the significance of these missing ingredients is to adopt a narrowly Western point of view. For though it is certainly true that the great battles of the Second World War in France and the desert were characterized by the employment of tanks and aircraft in abundance, and in high proportion to the number of accompanying infantrymen, those naked soldiers of the Somme and Waterloo whom we have seen standing and dying on the open battlefield, the fighting elsewhere was, for the great majority of combatants and for much of the time, as earthbound and snail-paced and soft-skinned a business as it had been for the 200 preceding years. The battles in the Pacific Islands and Burma were fought almost wholly without benefit of armor, beneath the jungle canopy almost without intervention by aircraft. The long campaign of Italy was fought by the Germans, without air cover and with few tanks. The great opening battles in Russia were conducted, except in the center of the front, by vast infantry armies, and despite interruptions like Kursk, the campaign remained until the last year, when the Russians had assembled their great tank armies. A war of shoe leather and horse flesh, to be eaten when times were hard. Men boiled their belts at Stalingrad, otherwise to be flogged across the endless acres of the steppe, now eastward, now westward, as the fortune of war directed. Stalingrad, in a sense, the battle of the war, wryly nicknamed Verdun on the Volga, was almost exclusively a battle between infantrymen, pinned beneath the ruins of the city by their competing artilleries. For the tanks which had carried the German advance thither proved useless within Stalingrad itself, while the tank columns with which the Russians eventually encircled their German attackers were unleashed far beyond the city's outskirts. It is startling, moreover, when one dissects any of the great tank battles themselves, to discover how little of the fighting took the form of the tank versus tank combat, commonly thought typical of that particular sort of event. The critical phase of the Battle of Kursk, July 11th to the 13th, did see enormous armadas of tanks locked in close-range combat within a comparatively confined arena, which was almost devoid of supporting infantry. In the final stage of the Goodwood offensive east of Caen, the British tanks, which arrived at the foot of Borbus Ridge, there to be destroyed by the heavier guns of the 1st SS Panzer Corps, had far outstripped their accompanying infantry by the speed of their advance, and time and again in the desert the Germans forced the British to throw their fragile Crusaders and Stuarts, unsupported by infantry escorts, onto the muzzles of their 88mm anti-tank guns, using their own not very superior Panzer Mark IIIs to bait the trap. Indeed, examples of heavy, important, even decisive tank versus tank engagements can be multiplied. The Avranches counter-attack, the Moscow winter offensive of 1942, the fighting in the Kiev salient in the winter of 1943, and so on down a very long list. But because of the composition of the forces engaged, most of the fighting between armored divisions was, in practice, fighting not between tanks and tanks, but between infantry and infantry. And the longer the war endured, the more was this the case. This sounds paradoxical, but the paradox is simply resolved by a glance at the types of subunits going to make up an armored division. Some of these subunits were, of course, tank regiments, but others were artillery and engineer regiments, and some were always infantry battalions. It was a wartime fashion to call these battalions armored infantry, Panzergrenadier in the German army. Appropriately enough, when they were provided, as were the 1st Panzergrenadier, with lightly armored half-tracks in which to move around the battlefield. But few armies, The Russian never, the British rarely, found themselves able to fit out the infantry battalions of their armored divisions with such expensive and specialized equipment. All, moreover, as the war progressed and the vulnerability of tanks to infantry anti-tank weapons emphasized itself, felt obliged to increase the proportion of infantry to tanks within their tank formations. Thus the Germans, whose early panzer divisions contained 4 tank regiments and over 500 tanks, as against 3 infantry battalions, had by the end of the war reversed the proportions so that 4 infantry battalions supported 2 tank regiments, with less than 150 tanks. This reversal was in part forced on them by their inability to produce tanks at the same rate as their enemies. The same failure which prevented them from providing more than 1 in 4 of their Panzer Grenadier battalions with armored transport, but, though exaggerated in their case, the same trend was detectable in the organizations of the more affluent armies over the same period. The British, who had begun the war with an armored division containing 6 tank regiments to a single infantry battalion, ended it with the same division having 5 infantry battalions to 4 tank regiments. The Americans, though they kept the number of infantry battalions in their armored divisions at 3 throughout the war, progressively reduced the number of tank regiments in it from 8 to 6 and finally to 3 also. A Second World War armored division in action, therefore, little resembled the fast-moving fleet of land ironclads, wheeling and shooting in unison, of which the visionaries of Blitzkrieg had dreamed. Occasionally, of course, as during Rommel's dash from the Meuse to Arras in 1940, or the British 30th Corps advance from the Seine to Brussels in 1944, a tank offensive could take on the character of a sea chase. But whenever tanks encounter tanks in large numbers, the speed slowed inevitably to a walking pace, punctured by long spells of immobility, and their operations, losing the simplicity of ship-to-ship actions, became heavily intermingled with confused infantry combats of a kind little different from those which soldiers of the First World War had experienced in many of the great offensives. For armored infantry, Panzergrenadier, motor riflemen, as the Americans, Germans, and British respectively entitled the infantry of their tank formations, though they might drive in their vehicles to wherever it was that their commanders wished them to fight, always, if only out of simple prudence, for their carriers made prime targets, dismounted at a safe distance from the enemy before moving too close with him. Once on the ground, they became as vulnerable to fire of every sort as any other infantrymen at any other time or place. General von Mellenthin's description of a Russian tank formations attack on the positions of the 19th Panzer Division on the Dnieper in October 1943 very clearly brings this out. During the artillery bombardment, no movement was possible, for 290 guns of all calibers were pounding 1,000 yards off front. They reached as far back as divisional battle headquarters, and the 2 divisions holding the corps front were shelled with such intensity that it was impossible to gauge the Schwerpunkt. After 2 hours' bombardment, our trench system looked like a freshly plowed field, and, in spite of being carefully dug in, many of our heavy weapons and anti-tank guns had been knocked out. Suddenly, Russian infantry in solid serried ranks attacked behind a barrage on a narrow front, with tanks in support and one wave following the other. Numerous low-flying planes attacked those strong points which were still firing. A Russian infantry attack is an awe-inspiring spectacle. The long gray waves come pounding on, uttering fierce cries, and the defending troops require nerves of steel. In dealing with such attacks, fire discipline is of vital importance. The Russian onslaught made some headway, but during the afternoon, the armored assault troops, whom we were keeping in reserve, were able to wipe out those Russians who had penetrated the defense system. We only lost a mile or so of ground. The interest of this passage lies at several levels. Like the work of many professional soldiers, it is written, whether deliberately or unconsciously is difficult to judge. In a sort of secret language, fire discipline is of vital importance. The key sentence means, though the meaning might be lost on the average civilian reader, that the German infantry had to hold the fire of their weapons until the Russians were very terrifyingly close to the holes in which they were lying, and then fire in sustained, simultaneous, and well-aimed bursts, to kill as many of the enemy as was possible before they, too, found the shelter of earth and caught their breath and their courage. To fire too late, not in any case the natural reaction, indeed its very opposite, would have been to be killed themselves. To fire too soon would have been to drive the Russians too quickly to cover, sparing many and leaving them with their will to advance unshaken, while calling down on the German positions a further helping of the terrible preparatory bombardment which they had undergone in the 2 preceding hours. But at another level, the interest is historical and literary. It lies in the similarity between the action portrayed and that so familiar to soldiers at the trench garrisons of the First World War. Indeed, in almost every respect, this is a First World War battle that von Mellenthin is describing, the presence of the tanks and planes being almost irrelevant, and the titles of the units, panzer regiments, motor rifle divisions, completely so. The predicament of the soldiers, whether attacking or defending, is exactly that of their predecessors of 1914 to 18. In similar circumstances, and their fate identical, we lost only a mile or so of ground. A great deal of territory to have surrendered, admittedly, on the Western Front in 1916, say, but quite within the bounds of concurrent normal experience on the Eastern, is a sentence which buries a lot of soldiers in a narrative of either war. But if many battles of the Second World War resemble, at the level of human experience, those of the First, what then was the function and achievement of all those thousands of tanks? About 250,000 were built in the Second World War, as against less than 10,000 in the First, which ranged the battlefields of 1939 to 45. Shermans, T-34s, Churchills, Tigers, Panthers, Mark IV Panzers, Cromwells, Matildas, Valentines, Stuarts, Grants, JS-3s, growling and clanking and rumbling across desert, steppe, pasture, tarmac, snowfield, floodplain. This is a complex question. It is best tackled by recognizing that function and achievement can, in this context, be quite different things, and indeed in practice were so. Most of the tanks catalogued above had a narrowly specialized function. The Churchill, for example, like the Matilda and the Valentine, was an infantry tank, descending directly from the trench crossing, wire-crushing mother of the First World War, and designed like it to destroy by fire or intimidation the resistance of enemy infantry in strong points. The Tiger, on the other hand, was, in the last resort, an anti-tank tank, the super dreadnought of the armored battlefield, able to outgun any opponent and to absorb or deflect its riposte. But in either case, the achievements of tanks of such specialized function could be only limited and local. The Churchill could fight infantry through a thick belt of wire in pillboxes, thus forcing forward an advance which, without its assistance, would have been stopped or repulsed. The Tiger, if at hand when the Churchill appeared, could destroy it and restore the front. But neither could do either of these things at much faster than at walking pace or over any distance, their enormous weight robbing them of speed and causing them so rapidly to wear out their tracks that, like modern pieces of earth-moving machinery, they had to be carried from place to place on specially constructed and quite unwarlike transporters. The Sherman, however, or the T-34 or the Panzer Mark III, though none of them a match in gun power or armor for the specialized heavies, could, at rare moments of opportunity, transform the character of a whole campaign. They could not do it often, nor could they do it to order, for it required the concurrence of conditions and circumstances beyond the mere concentration of a superiority of armor. But when this transformation occurred, the focus of fighting could be shifted 100 miles in a week, as it was in France in May 1940, or in Poland in June 1944, and the routines of the contending armies turned topsy-turvy. How this transformation was achieved was not a function of the tank's speed, nor of their capacity to overcome the resistance of the enemy lying in their path. For tanks which merely break through the enemy lines and mortar off into the distance have a short life expectancy. Mechanical breakdowns, to which tanks are preternaturally prone, will quickly thin their numbers and exhaustion of fuel, of which they carry enough for only a few hours driving, will shortly thereafter bring the remainder to a halt. The armored breakthrough, about which all commanders have, since September 1939, dreamt or had nightmares, require therefore considerable preparation. A great deal will be purely administrative, the concentration of troops, weapons, and supplies at the point chosen for the attempt at breakthrough. Such administrative preparation is essential. Some strategic commentators regard it indeed as the be-all and end-all of generalship. But preparation has, in the military context, another and more important sense, as in preparatory bombardment. Here it means something different, to inflict such damage on the enemy as will prepare him, set him up for the blow, designed to do him the real injury, which is to follow. This is the sort of preparation which is crucial to an armored breakthrough. Very occasionally it can be avoided or dispensed with, either because the antecedents of the attack are so cloaked in surprise, as they were before the Ardennes offensive of December 1944, or because the army which is to receive it is so unfamiliar with the potentiality of armored forces, as was the French on the Meuse in May 1940, that the victims' power of resistance are numbed by the shock of the main attack itself. But circumstances like these occur very rarely, normally only at the beginning of a war, or else on a front long quiet. Very much more often, the defender's powers of resistance must be worn down by a protracted process of combat. Attrition is the word we would use today, before a general will judge it safe to release his armor for the breakthrough. Attrition, however, is too painful a process for any enemy to submit to it willingly. Something like the Wehrmacht in Normandy in 1944. He must submit willy-nilly, and then the battle he fights will follow the prescribed stages of fixing, attrition, and breakthrough. But if he is given warning, or has space at his disposal, he will behave differently. Given warning, he will dig, wire, and mine himself in, as did the Russians at Kursk, so securely that the attacker's effort at attrition will exhaust only the attacker's strength. Given space, he will, like Manstein in his Kharkov counterstroke of February 1943, break contact at the first sign of an attack and withdraw, so opening up the battle and making it fluid, forcing the enemy to fight on ground unfamiliar to him, but well known to the defender, and on terms and to a timetable which the defender, not he, dictates, if the attacker is to achieve his breakthrough. Therefore, the enemy must be made to stand, to fight resolutely, that is, on the ground on which he is attacked, replacing the troops progressively consumed in its defense with others from his reserve, until he has no more to feed him forward. If then the attacker, by better husbandry, still retains a surplus, and if that surplus contains a sizable armored element, he is in a position to achieve armored breakthrough. Yet breakthrough will not follow of its own accord, nor even by the tanks making ground on the far side of any gap they open in the enemy's lines. More is necessary than that. The tanks must get the army to follow them, but an army's readiness to advance when the opportunity offers is by no means automatic and spontaneous. There is, indeed, a very powerful resistance to movement in all modern armies, which is partly material and partly psychological in character, and so strong that it may even be compared in its effect to that offered by the enemy. The psychological resistance is perhaps the easier to understand, for though shelter, warmth, recreation, variety of diet are things taken for granted at one's fireside, we know that they are hard to come by on campaign, and may guess that, when found, will be valued all the more highly for that reason and surrendered reluctantly. A good billet, a quiet area, a better hole are, indeed, for all but the most exceptional spirit, what every veteran soldier seeks, and his readiness to make of them a temporary substitute for home is something against which a thrusting commander must struggle hard if he is to keep his campaign alive. Even a half-good billet, a downright awful hole, will tempt the soldier to bide. How strong the temptation is was brought home to me when, while studying a large-scale trench map of the Western Front, I asked my father if his battery of 6-inch guns had not been positioned in the area it covered. He agreed that it was, and at once began to point out on it, with that faculty of total topographical recall, undimmed by 50 years' absence, apparently possessed by all survivors of the First World War, its salient features. Here was the orchard where the battery had had its fighting post, and there ran the gun lines. But, and clearly more important to him, here was the lock on the canal in which they had swum on fine afternoons. Here the field in which they had played football. That was the farmhouse where the family Courvoisier had cooked them omelettes. They had a son away at the war and a soft spot for soldiers, particularly if they spoke a little French. There was the cavalry under which he had waited in the evenings for his elder brother to walk over from a neighboring battery with scraps of news from home, listening in the dangerous darkness for the ring of his spurs along the pave. It was obvious that this square mile of Picardy, for all its devastation and terror, had come to have for him in the few months he spent there something of the familiarity, even the security, of the rural Staffordshire in which he had grown up. And it was not only he who found his Staffordshire in France, all over the Zone des Armées. This indeed is the point of Mottram's Spanish farm. There was individuals, groups of friends, whole units shutting out what they could of the war, making their little temporary worlds, resisting change, putting down roots. Yet the strongest roots which the British or any modern army puts down were and are material. Its face was towards the enemy which stood in its path, but holding it down onto, even dragging it back along that path, was a densely woven net of what staff officers call rear links to divisional dumps, water points, telephone exchanges, railheads, ammunition parks, ordnance depots, whose function was to extend the reach of the army, but whose effect, centripetal rather than centrifugal, was to attract it backwards towards its own base. These links were in theory elastic, but they were to prove notably rigid whenever the strain of an advance was thrown upon them. While the points to which they were anchored, corps and army bases, field parks, headquarters, forage and shell dumps, hospitals, were virtually immovable, it would take months of peace in 1918-19 to prise them loose from the subsoil. The armies of the Second World War were organized for movement, proved less immobile in an emergency, but, despite the fleet-footed appearance which their flotillas of trucks lent them, they were effectively equipped only for short-range journeying. Asked to advance any distance at speed, they would demand the use of railways, which the enemy or friendly partisans or their own air force would assuredly have just finished destroying. The free use of railways guarantees, in any case, no certain rapidity of movement, as the snail-like pace of the French army's advance from its railheads into Lorraine in August 1914 demonstrates something much more than mere means of transport, though transport is even more vital than a burning belief in the power of the offensive. And that was very strong in the French army of 1914, is necessary if an army is to be impelled into rapid forward motion. The army needs a vision, a dream, a nightmare, or some mixture of the three if it is to be electrified into a headlong advance. In 1914, the German army, footing itself 20 miles southward day after day, was possessed by a vision: total victory in 6 weeks, the overthrow of the French army, entry into La Ville Lumière, the triumphal defile down the Champs-Élysées. But visions like these present themselves rarely, and, however hard a general may try to conjure them into being, usually defy his artifices. Or, to put it more accurately in the past tense, usually defied. For it is possible to argue that while the mechanization of armies has produced a revolution in warfare, the real consequence, its effective potential for change, is not material but psychological. That tanks, in short, should be thought of not so much as weapons, but as theatrical devices, de ex machina, by the maneuvering of which a general is enabled so to manipulate the emotions, so to stimulate the responses of his army, that his resistance to movement is overcome, its tendency to self-protection transcended, and his normal rhythm of campaigning shattered by the imposition of a higher object than that of holding one's ground, driving the enemy off one's front, or even registering an incontestable victory. That higher object is the rescue of comrades in danger. It is an object which the use of parachute troops allows a general to impose in an even more imperative form. In the Arnhem operation, for example, Montgomery was able to use the predicament of the 6th Airborne Division, which had been air-landed deep within enemy-held territory, as a spur to the advance of the Guards' Armored Division, and the exposure of the Guards' tanks on the Via Dolorosa, northward from the Allies' lines, as a prod to the rest of the 30th Corps' infantry trailing behind. The French, in operations like Lorraine and northern Indochina, where they parachuted battalions into the heart of the Viet Minh fastness and challenged the road-bound columns to reach them, elevated this technique to the level of a strategic principle. But it is too risky a technique, as the outcome of Arnhem established, to be employed often. The armored thrust, on the other hand, offers a general the chance both to titillate his soldiers' sense of solidarity with comrades at risk and to control the degree of risk to which they are exposed. It is possible to miscalculate, of course, as did Rommel in the Crusader battle in November 1941. And then the armored thrust must withdraw if it is not to wither where it comes to rest. If its reach is calculated right, as it was by Hitler in May 1940, or by Hoth and Guderian in the Russian summer of 1941, the infantry, haunted by the nightmare of leaving the tank crews to die alone, will struggle forward somehow across the chasm that yawns between their line of departure and the tank's foremost point of advance. A chasm which in other circumstances they would rightly think unbridgeable, and by a week or a fortnight of unreasonable effort, as much moral as physical the demands it makes on them, transform by their advance the course of a whole campaign. The nature of battle. There is, then, as much psychological trickery to the consummation of a breakthrough as there is material preparation and rational control, certainly without the working of this moral confidence trick, which plays on the soldier's sense of unity, which with isolated comrades, and feeds on the exhilaration cumulatively generated by the dash to their rescue. No breakthrough could be engineered. But there is an anterior and yet more important psychological trick to be played before a breakthrough can occur, one which, as we have seen, has to be pulled off in both armies. The attacking and defending, that of getting their soldiers to stand, for unless soldiers have stood, squared up to each other, exchanged blow for blow and felt the heavier tell, a breakthrough will indeed have no more lasting effects than any other stroke of trickery. Easy victories between equals almost never stick. The defeated lick their wounds, nurse their grievances, and wait for the odds to even out again. The easiness of Germany's victories in 1870 goes far to explain the bitterness which the French harbored against her for 40 years, and the magnitude of the price they exacted in revenge on the battlefields of 1914 to 18. Hitler's easy victories of June-August 1941 bought him the agonies of Stalingrad in the same way and for the same reason that Pearl Harbor cost Japan the defeat of Leyte Gulf. And in our own decade, we have seen the Arab armies, adamant in the refusal to accept Israel's lightning victories of 1967 as a fair test of their relative worths, return to the struggle and insist on repeating the trial. It is for this reason that it is possible to say that the tank, though it has transformed the pace and appearance of modern campaigning, has not changed the nature of battle. The focus of fighting may be shifted 20 miles in a single day by an armored thrust, but wherever it comes to rest, there must take place exactly the same sort of struggles between man and man which battlefields have seen since armies came into being. Battle, therefore, and this is not an idea which must be pushed to extremes, as it was by Foch and the offensive school of French strategists before the First World War, is essentially a moral conflict. It requires, if it is to take place, a mutual sustained act of will by two contending parties, and, if it is to result in a decision, the moral collapse of one of them. How protracted that act of will must be, and how complete that moral collapse, is not something about which one can be specific. In an ideal battle, the act would be sustained long enough for the collapse to be total, and in practice, that ideal situation was almost perfectly realized at Waterloo. But although one would like to say that a battle is something which happens between two armies, leading to the moral and then physical disintegration of one or the other of them, and this is as near to a working definition of what a battle is that one is likely to get. Few battles see both armies making so sustained and complete a moral commitment, or either coming to so final an end. Armies may indeed commit themselves fervently to the cause of bringing about the other's disintegration and utterly fail to achieve it, despite appalling human loss, as happened on the Somme. Armies again may step quite lightheartedly onto the battlefield and suffer there a shattering moral catastrophe, as overtook the French at Agincourt. But the result, negative or wrong in such less than ideal cases, does not mean that these encounters escape from the definition of what a battle is, or, contrarily, vitiate it. Some of the moral effects which a stalemate or a misfired battle have on some of its survivors will be identical to those felt by victors or vanquished in a battle which meets the definition exactly. They, having found, from whatever source, and that is a very complicated matter, the moral resolution to stand, will inwardly have enjoyed their reward or paid the penalty. When Sir Herbert Butterfield proposes in Man on His Past, therefore, that every battle in world history must be different from every other battle, but they must have something in common if we can group them under the term battle at all. Without mooting what that thing in common may be, we are now in a position to submit a suggestion. It is not something strategic, nor tactical, nor material, nor technical. It is not something any quantity of colored maps will reveal, or any collection of comparative statistics of strengths and casualties, or even any set of parallel readings from the military classics, though the classics brilliantly illuminate our understanding of battle once we have arrived at it. What battles have in common is human, the behavior of men struggling to reconcile their instinct for self-preservation, their sense of honor, and the achievement of some aim over which other men are ready to kill them. The study of battle is therefore always a study of fear, and usually of courage, always of leadership, usually of obedience, always of compulsion, sometimes of insubordination, always an anxiety, sometimes of elation or catharsis, always of uncertainty and doubt, misinformation and misapprehension, usually also of faith and sometimes of vision, always of violence, sometimes also of cruelty, self-sacrifice, compassion. Above all, it is always a study of solidarity and usually also of disintegration. For it is towards the disintegration of human groups that battle is directed. It is necessarily a social and psychological study, but it is not a study only for the sociologist or the psychologist, and indeed ought not perhaps to be properly a study for either. For the human group in battle, and the quality and source of the stress it undergoes, are drained of life and meaning by the laboratory approach which social scientists practice. Battle belongs to finite moments in history, to the societies which raise the armies which fight them, to the economies and technologies which those societies sustain. Battle is a historical subject whose nature and trend of development can only be understood down a long historical perspective. The trend of battle. What is the trend of battle's development? This is too large a question to be tackled without some refinement, and, even though I began with the idea of looking only at battle fought inside the same climatic and geographical zone, Northwest Europe, between ethnic in-groups, white Europeans, and within a framework of the same value system, Western Christianity, I am not sure that such limitations refine it as much as it needs to be. So many other factors besides climate, terrain, and ethos intrude, most obvious among which are those of technology and economics. Luckily, however, if we are looking at battle as a situation which encompasses the individual and his group within a given time span and a circumscribed locality, most may be excluded. For though the rise of industry has enormously enhanced the power which states can deploy against each other in war, and the improvement in weapons has almost infinitely extended the range of a general's reach, the predicament of the individual on the battlefield has, at whatever moment we choose to examine, still to be measured on one quite short scale, that of the physical and mental endurance of himself and his group. Men can stand only so much of anything, and dead men are dead whether killed by arrow or high explosive. So that what needs to be established for our purposes is not the factor by which the mechanization of battle has multiplied the cost of waging war to the states involved, but the degree to which it has increased the strain thrown on the human participants. How do we mark off the degrees on the scale we want to draw? The world of mountaineering offers us a useful analogy. Mountains, like battlefields, are places inherently dangerous for the individual to inhabit. It is less easy to get killed, of course, on a mountain, if one takes sensible precautions, than on a battlefield, yet the risk of death always stalks the climber, just as it attracts him to the mountain in the first place, and numbers of climbers are killed on every major range every year. But the degree of danger to which the climber is exposed varies between quite wide limits, determined by the height of the summit to which he aspires, the steepness and inaccessibility of the face. Exposure is the technical term, up which he chooses to make his ascent, the severity and predictability of weather conditions the face attracts, and the stability of the material of which it is composed. The higher the summit, at least in alpine climbing, the colder the ascent, and the longer too, which adds fatigue to the dangers, the more unpredictable the weather, the higher the risk of being trapped on the face, the sharper its gradient, and the more unstable its composition. The greater the objective dangers, avalanche, ice splinters, falling stones, sometimes significantly called mountain artillery by German climbers, are perhaps the most lethal of all mountaineering's hazards, because they materialize with the least warning and are caused by factors least subject to the climber's control. At the beginning of this century, when climbers began to travel widely in search of new climbs, an attempt was made to collate the difficulties each offered so that a stranger would know whether or not it was within his capabilities. And though the British, the French, the Swiss, and the Italians each produced a different system of classification for their own mountains, the systems roughly agreed in recognizing 6 grades of severity, from easy to extremely difficult. Warning that a face was at the upper end of the scale was usually enough to deter beginners from tackling it, while most climbers were content to confine themselves to those in the middle band. The system thus achieved their purpose, but just before the outbreak of the Second World War, a new spirit took hold of top-class European climbers, which made the classification of the most spectacular climbs thenceforth attempted and achieved more and more difficult. The spirit was that of extreme climbing to the limits of what is physically and psychologically possible by artificial methods, the use of metal pegs hammered into the rock on faces where no natural hand or footholds can be found. These methods stimulated a violent hostility among the traditional alpinist, who had developed a romanticist philosophy of mountaineering which laid stress on its spiritual value to man through the harmony it engendered between him and nature, leading them to describe the extremist feat as perversions, degradations, and evil demonstrations, and the outcome of the best publicized of the early essays in extreme technique, the 1935 and 1936 attempts on the unclimbable north face of the Eiger, which killed all 6 of those who set foot on it, lent force to the disapproval by suggesting that there were indeed affronts which the spirit of the mountains was not prepared to tolerate. In 1938, however, the north face was conquered by extreme technique that since the war has been climbed again and again. By the 1960s, the mere ascent was commonplace. Additional hazards were sought to add spice and sensation to that climb and to others, climbing in the depth of winter or climbing direct up the line which a drop of water would follow if it fell directly from the summit. Finally, climbing both direct and in winter, at first on lesser peaks like the Cima Grande and the Dolomites, ultimately on the Eiger itself. But by the time this stage had been reached, the classical grading systems had lost most of their meaning. Much of the climbing was of standard 5 or 6, but the technical difficulties paled beside the objective dangers. The volleys of stones traveling at killing speeds down the face, the showers of ice splinters, the avalanches, the lightning strikes to which the extreme climber hung about with the ironware of his fad, actually acted as a point of attraction, while the objective dangers were themselves overshadowed by what we may call, though it is not a term mountaineers use, the subjective dangers. For several days on the big faces, and several days was what superderrima demanded, drove men to the end of their physical resources, and with their strength went their will and their courage, upon which everything else in extreme climbing depends. Climbing, always a test of nerve and of physical skill, had been transformed by the mania of the extremists, who were now using electric drills, expanding bolts, and what looks to the ignorant suspiciously like pieces of scaffolding in their search for more and more direct lines, into a battle of attrition in which willpower and endurance were paramount, and the casualties which they suffered bore comparison with those inflicted in attritional warfare of the first 70 climbers who attempted the Egerwand between 1935 and 1958. 17 were killed on it, either by falling or from exposure. These figures provide material for an arresting comparison. 2 of these, Hintertorsier, after whom one of the most difficult traverses on the face is called, and Kurz, whose heroism in death has become one of the legends of alpine climbing, were, as it happens, both taking leave from the German army to tackle the climb. Their regiment, the 100th Gerbers Jäger, was that subsequently chosen during the airborne invasion of Crete in May 1941 to crash land on the runway at Malem Airport under the guns of the defending New Zealanders. Perhaps the single most reckless operation of the war, though the one which turned the battle from a disaster to a victory for the Germans, and in doing so suffered about 150 casualties out of a strength of 800, an 18% ratio, contrasted with 24% for the first 13 Eiger attempts. Thus, an operation of war of the most extreme kind was actually proved slightly less dangerous to the unit involved than the chosen diversion of its bravest spirits. If, then, we are asking the question, has mountaineering got more dangerous over the past century? The answer is, as practiced at the top of the league, yes. What had begun as a one-day event, a scramble up the easiest route to the top of any mountain which took the fancy of a group of friends, either because of its prominence or its promise of a prospect. A day to be enjoyed for the pleasure it brought in exercising one's agility, testing one's nerve, practicing team spirit, and enjoying God's great outdoors, has become in our own time a sort of military operation, in which sport imitates war, and war of the dreariest, deadliest, most long-drawn-out sort. Indeed, the hard men of the Winter Eiger Direct crouched shivering day after day in their tiny, filthy, smelly snow holes, hacked with infinite labor out of the face, depressed by the death of comrades, short of food, and expecting from moment to moment to be swept out of existence by the explosion of an avalanche. Recalled none so vividly as the soldiers of Paulus' Sixth Army, freezing to death in identical snow holes among the ruins of Stalingrad. But the question we want to ask, of course, is whether we can put Agincourt, Waterloo, and the Somme on a comparable scale of severity, and say with confidence 2, 4, and 6. Can we grade them for technical difficulty, exposure, length, and objective dangers? Even if we decide we can, will that lead us to the conclusion that the risk to the individual frontline soldier on the battlefield has been rising throughout the period under review? Length. One statement can be safely made, is indeed a commonplace. Battles have been getting longer. Agincourt could have been timed in hours and minutes, and Waterloo, though part of a 3-day ordeal, as we have seen, for several regiments, was for others a one-day affair. For that reason, it was rated less severe by Wellington than Talavera, which had lasted 2 days and a night. But 50 years later, Gettysburg, bloodiest of the battles of the American Civil War, endured 3 days, from mid-morning on the 1st to late afternoon on the 3rd. And by the beginning of the 20th century, battles between large armies like that of Liaoyang, between the Russians and Japanese in Manchuria, could occupy a fortnight. By the middle of the First World War, their span had reached several months. The Somme had an official duration of 4.5 months, July 1st to November 18th. Passchendaele of just over 3, July 31st to November 10th, 1917. Verdun of 10, February 21st to December 20th, 1916. Indeed, were not for the instance of Stalingrad, August 23rd to 1942 to January 31st, 1943, and Normandy, June 6th to August 25th, 1944. It might even be argued that battles have been getting shorter since 1918, but that argument would probably straggle off into a discussion of what the word battle means, it being a perfectly tenable view that much of the fighting of the First and Second World Wars was not battle, as that concept has generally been understood, but siege, something much more limited and concrete in its aim and almost always much more protracted in its conduct. If indeed we compare the battles of the First World War with the sieges of Petersburg in the American Civil War, which lasted 10 months, or of Sevastopol in the Crimea, which lasted a year, their comparative prolongation looks more apparent than real. But just as no soldier fought through the entire period of the Somme, Neither did his counterpart at Petersburg or Sevastopol spend every day under fire in the trenches. Sieges, as Roger Fenton's or Matthew Brady's photographs remind us, have their quiet moments. Even the Somme had its quiet moments, and, more important than that, it was run as a battle on a strict system of turn and turn about. The regiments which had made the great attack were almost all withdrawn the following day. Most of the German regiments which repelled it were relieved within the week, and so to demonstrate the lengthening of battles is not necessarily to prove a heightening of risk to the individual. Nevertheless, big, protracted battles make insatiable demands on a general's stock of regiments, often requiring him to use some time and again on the same piece of ground. Sometimes the very intensity of the conflict precludes relief, and some armies are organized in a way that commits the individual to long spells in the line, either without interruption or at best with only the shortest intervals of relief. The Red Army, and this must be counted one of the most insidious cruelties which the Second World War inflicted on the Russian people, granted no home leave to its soldiers from beginning to end. Men remained with their units until killed or disabled, and while they lived, many, having mentally abandoned their families, took field wives from among their women comrades. Curiously, the American army also so ran itself during that war that a man, once assigned to a fighting unit, which it was American policy to keep continuously in the line for long periods, making out losses by individual replacement, could look forward to a release from danger only through death or wounds. A sensation of endlessness and hopelessness resulted, so depressing and widespread in its effects that it eventually prompted the High Command to institute fixed terms of combat duty, of which the controversial Vietnam Year is the best known consequence. Even during the most reluctant soldier's year in Vietnam, however, he could find himself in combat, as at the siege of Khe Sanh, for day after day. The character of the battle itself precluded his relief. Even more so was this the case, say, during the Battle of Normandy, whose intensity required that British regiments, which would normally have expected regular breaks in their spells in the line, be left wherever they had been put after landing for week upon week. 3 Commando, a raiding force intended and equipped for the briefest of exposure to the enemy, spent 2 months in the Bois de Bavant on the extreme left flank of the Normandy bridgehead, losing meanwhile most of its officers and over half its men. And in the First World War, regiments not uncommonly underwent the worst possible combination of ordeals, that of being relieved from a battle after intense engagement and then sent back until losses had exceeded 100% of the original strength. In this way, at Verdun, the German 3rd Jaeger and 87th Infantry each lost, in a few weeks, more than the original number of soldiers with which they had entered the battle. Objective dangers. Thus the prolongation of battles. While it may not mean that the modern soldier has to submit to any single spell of combat longer than that which one of Grant's or Wellington's men underwent, though its practice it generally does, has certainly heightened the risk to the individual by multiplying the occasion on which the same battle, may summon him to its service. What of the risks he run on the battlefield when he reaches it, whether for the first, second, or third time? This is a complex matter to unravel, because it is entangled with the dimensions of the battlefield, and with the sort of weapons deployed and the degree of protection which the soldier can find on it. Clearly, it has always been very dangerous to be in the killing zone, whether that be 200 yards wide, as it was at Agincourt, half a mile as at Waterloo, or upwards of 5 miles as on the Somme. But the widening of the zone, besides enlarging the number of people in hazard, has probably also intensified the danger to its occupants, particularly at the front of the zone, forward edge of the battle area, FEBA, as staff college students are taught to call it. We can be fairly certain about this because, though the percentage of casualties suffered in battle as far apart in time as Waterloo and the Somme are of the same order of comparison, the rate at which they were inflicted in time sharply diverged. In the 2 battles, the 1st Battalion, in its killing Fusiliers, suffered 427 and 528 casualties, out of 698 and 801 soldiers engaged, casualty rates of 61 and 70% respectively. But at Waterloo, as we have seen, the infliction of casualties was spread out over 3 hours. On the Somme, the losses were probably suffered in the first 30 minutes. The battalions on both occasions were ruined, but the process of ruination occupied only 1/6 of the time on the Somme as it had at Waterloo. Moreover, despite improvements in medical care of the wounded, and even allowing that arrangements for the collection of the wounded broke down on the Somme, it is significant that the proportion of fatal to non-fatal casualties suffered by the battalion in the two battles differed sharply. At Waterloo, 117 soldiers were killed or succumbed to their wounds. On the Somme, 245, a fatal casualty rate of 27 and 43% respectively. This, of course, is far too tiny a sample on which to erect any sort of an argument, but it is offered not as evidence in a dubious case, but as illustration of something that does not really need demonstration, that the killing power of weapons and the volume of munitions available to feed them has been rising throughout the last 2 centuries. With predictable results. The longbows of the Agincourt archers, the muskets of the Waterloo infantrymen were very effective agents for the temporary transformation of an airspace of modest dimensions into an atmosphere of high lethality. But modest and temporary are the important qualifications. By the beginning of the First World War, soldiers possessed the means to maintain a lethal environment over wide areas for sustained periods. Hence the title of some of the war's most deeply felt novels, La Feu, Under Fire, by Henry Barbusse. A Man Could Stand Up, by Ford Madox, Ford, and In Stahlgewittern, Storm of Steel, by Ernst Junger, though which each of these soldier authors sought to convey in a phrase to their readers what it was about the new warfare which made it different from all other warfare men had hitherto experienced, that had marooned them, as it were, on an undiscovered continent, where one layer of the air on which they depended for life was charged with lethal metallic particles, where man in consequence was forced to adopt a subterranean dwelling and an abject posture, where the use of day and night were reversed, and where, by bizarre modification of Erewhonian logic, good health was regarded as a burden, but wounds as a benefaction to be sought and enjoyed. It was as if the arms manufacturers had succeeded in introducing a new element into the atmosphere, compounded of fire and steel, whose presence rendered battlefields uninhabitable, giving them that eerily empty look which, to an experienced 20th century soldier, is a prime indicator that danger lies all about. The introduction of poison gas into warfare, first employed by the Germans at Ypres in 1915, did of course actually bring about a chemical change in the atmosphere of the battlefield, and for a time, which persisted into the 1940s, its deadliness was thought unsurpassable, but subsequent advances in metallurgy and projectile design, accompanied by reductions in the cost and availability of high explosive, have allowed mechanical killing agents to overhaul in its lethality once more. Today, a ready abundance of anti-personnel mines, first widely used in the Second World War, claymore mines, giant static shotgun charges, high fragmentation grenades and shells, and subcaliber ammunition for the automatic weapons now universally carried by infantrymen, provide even quite small units with the means to so deluge their fronts with airborne metal as to make them virtually unapproachable by anyone lacking armored protection. So abundant have those killing agents become, to say nothing of those fired from larger, more distant weapons or launched from the air, that the underlying aim of weapons training has now in many armies been changed, for the traditional object, that of teaching the soldiers to hit a selected target, has been substituted that of teaching a group to create an impenetrable zone, akin in character to one of those meteorite belts, which it is supposed will offer such hazards to travelers when and if men venture into deep space. The soldiers of French infantry platoons are taught to fire out only to 200 meters, marksmanship where necessary, being left to a pair of tres d'élite. The Italian infantry platoon is equipped almost exclusively with submachine guns, effective only for spraying the immediate neighborhood with bullets, and requiring no greater skill to use than a housewife needs to spray her kitchen with insecticide from an aerosol can. And, lest these instances be thought a bit by the by, the Russian, German, and American infantry companies are each armed with automatic weapons only, firing the modern lightened ammunition, of which the infantryman can carry twice or three times the supply provided to his counterpart of the Second World War. Wasting ammunition for decades, the cardinal military sin, has in consequence become a military virtue. Hitting the target, for centuries the principal military skill, is henceforth to be left to the law of averages. Perhaps only in the British Army, traditionally a guild of sharpshooters, and in Northern Ireland in the 1970s embroiled in a campaign which requires its soldiers to fire back at terrorist gunmen without touching the bystanders, whom the gunmen use as cover, is marksmanship still lauded and taught. Exposure. Danger buried beneath the soil of the battlefield, wafted by its breezes, suffusing in solid from its air space. Mines, gas projectiles, these objective dangers, some new, some as old as warfare, have, through a superabundance of supply, made the killing zone, even at its foremost edge, a yet more dangerous place for the soldier to inhabit in the 20th century than it has ever been before. Indeed, the new superfluity of killing agents has brought about a situation of which none of the classical strategists glimpsed even a prefiguration. The transformation of the very environment of the battlefield into one almost wholly and indiscriminately hostile to man. Moreover, and this is a development, at least from the standpoint of the individual, of perhaps even greater significance, the size of the area which this hostile environment encompasses grows constantly bigger, yet within boundaries of progressively greater rigidity. Of what this portends for the individual, mountaineering again offers a view, for the modern fashion of combining extreme technique with very long ascents has increased the degree of exposure, danger of falling, risk of stone falls, to almost intolerable limits, which making retreat from exposed situations more and more difficult. The fate of Sedlamer and Mehringer, the first alpinists to attempt the Eigerwand, illustrates the hazards of the trend. At the end of 5 days and 4 nights on the face, for most of which they had been lost from sight of the watchers below, they reappeared, still moving upwards. Tourists expressed optimism. The mountain guides and experienced climbers kept silent. They realized that the pair's line of retreat had been cut off by avalanches and stonefalls on the lower slopes, and that their only hope now was to fight a way to the top. Before they could fight their way out, the cold of the north face killed them both, at a point on its center too far for any rescue party to reach from the summit or the flanks of the peak. Thus it was the very size of the north face and its unrelentingly hostile character which, as much as anything, did for them. And in the same way it is the very size of modern battlefields which, given the objective dangers present, invest them with such peril for the individual soldier. For it is now almost impossible to run away from a battle. A rational army would run away, thought Montesquieu, implying that in his time soldiers had the choice. In practice it was a choice which their leaders devoted a great deal of effort to prevent them from exercising. The common soldier must fear his officer more than the enemy, Frederick the Great, but when the lesser fear overcame the greater, run men could and did. The first moments of flight, as Dupic convincingly demonstrates, were probably the most dangerous of any a soldier could spend on the battlefield, because it was then that he was most exposed to the enemy's blows. But if he could clear the killing zone without being shot in the back, or sabred by a pursuing cavalryman, he had a good chance of getting off unscathed. At Agincourt, as we saw, a large number of the French cavalry force, savaged by the arrow cloud, veered off into the neighboring wood which, within a few seconds' riding, offered them perfect safety, and at Waterloo, a considerable body of Belgian troops, having taken refuge in equally convenient woods, waited there around their cooking fires until the decrescendo of the evening persuaded them danger had passed. This right to flight is naturally not one which generals are willing to concede, but its availability is one of the things which in the past have made battle bearable. By allowing the soldier to believe that his presence on the battlefield was ultimately voluntary, and it has been frequently exercised by armies of all nations, not always with results fatal either to individuals or the greater cause. First Bull Run, the Second Battle of the Somme, and Kasserine provide the most obvious modern verifications of the half-truth, that he who fights and runs away lives to fight another day. Indeed, for an army to run away can be to inflict a very serious frustration on its enemy's plans. Schlieffen's fear that the Russians would refuse to stand their ground was the principal factor in persuading him to frame his notorious design for a lightning victory against France, which the French retreat to the Marne brought to naught in 1914, and the rapidity with which an intact French army recoiled towards the Marne before the Blitzkrieg in 1940 prompted Hitler, his mind awash with memories of 1914, to spare the British at Dunkirk, lest he lose in battle with them the tanks he would need to rewrite that page of history. It is not, however, the frustration of the enemy's plan, but the preservation of his own person, which a soldier wishes when he turns tail on the battlefield. And the evidence very strongly suggests that flight with less and less will serve his purpose. For, to the soldier on foot, the dimensions of modern battlefields, perhaps 100 miles wide by 20 deep, perhaps even more, and certainly 30 to 50 times as large as those of the 18th century, put their boundaries almost beyond his reach. Even if reached, they are likely to prove impenetrable. Moreover, for the modern battlefield, unlike that of the past, is more crowded at its rear than at its forward edge. Fighting soldiers are now in a minority in armies, a fact over which staff officers chronically agonize, and the fighting soldier who has decided to fight no more will find his passage rearward impeded by a thickening host of administrative soldiers, not to say by military policemen whose duty it precisely is to prevent fugitives from making good their escape. All the more will this congestion make things difficult for the soldier who tries to leave the battlefield by vehicle, for control of roads and bridges is a principal task of rear area troops, while enemy aircraft, though they may ignore, and perhaps not even see, the foot soldier on the ground are magnetized by vehicles in motion. The chances are, however, that the errant foot soldier will be as visible from the air as he is from ground level, for modern battlefields, if fought over at all long, quickly wear threadbare. Trees and bushes disappear, buildings are leveled, even the contours of the ground disturbed. Movement on the surface becomes impossible by day, and because of artificial illumination and, now, infrared surveillance, hazardous by night. The nocturnal and subterranean patterns of living which these phenomena impose is commonly thought characteristic only of the First World War, in which the art and strategic advantages of defilation were discovered by accident, but it was a pattern also dominant on many Second World War battlefields, very generally in the Korean War and a variety of places in Vietnam and Israel. The would-be fugitive, trapped on the naked face of the modern battlefield, may therefore find, like Sedlamer and Mehringer, no alternative but to fight on, hoping to gain through the defeat of the enemy the release he knows he cannot win by retreat. Yet there is one alternative, familiar to students of siege warfare, and questioned by them: internal desertion. Impracticable in a well-organized fortress, it flourished, particularly among civilians, whenever a commandant failed to concentrate all food in his own stores. Modern battlefields, because so difficult to escape from, encourage among soldiers a siege mentality, but, because of the prodigality of modern military supply, are often littered with preserved food. A soldier who has decided to soldier no more, who prefers not to desert to the enemy, and who can find somewhere to hide may, therefore, sometimes manage to sit out the fighting. If it remains static for considerable periods, the waste of the old Somme battlefield, pitted with dugouts and trenches over many square miles, were, during 1917, colonized by a freebooting gang of Australians who lived by raiding military dumps and eluded the search of the military police for many months, some say until the end of the war. More significant was the desertion of a large number of the non-French garrison at Dien Bien Phu, who burrowed themselves holes in the banks of the little river which traversed the enceinte of the fortress, and pilfered what they needed to live from the loads parachuted inside the perimeter each night, sometimes fighting the combatants for shares. At the end of the siege, they are believed to have outnumbered the active garrison. Accident. In addition to the other benefits of internal desertion, largely theoretical of course, for the activity remains very unusual, perhaps because the necessary conditions arrive so infrequently, is its elimination of the accidental dangers attendant on soldiering. Accident has always caused a proportion of battles' deaths and wounds, though exactly what that proportion is for earlier battles is difficult to estimate. The men-at-arms suffocated beneath the press of bodies at Agincourt, and the Frenchmen who were certainly injured in the return cavalry charge, must have been numerous. But it was lethal intent which, to an overwhelming degree, killed in the age of edged weapons. With the appearance of firearms, accidents became much more common. I have described several which occurred at Waterloo, mostly as a result of what the army calls accidental discharges, guns going off unexpectedly. And it was not only small arms which were dangerous to users or their friends. Great guns could also kill. Mercer describes how one of his gunners stumbled beside the mouth of the cannon he was serving at the moment of firing. As a man naturally does when falling, he threw out both his arms before him, and they were blown off at the elbows, probably by the stream of explosive gas rather than by the ball itself. Mercer later heard that he had bled to death on the way to the surgeon. As armies have accumulated more and heavier machinery, and more volatile and more powerful explosives, the toll of accidents has risen still further. Tanks are notoriously dangerous to the infantry who accompany them into action, their drivers' visibility being very limited, and armored cars are dangerous to their own crews, being easily overturned when driven fast over rough going. The 2nd Household Cavalry Regiment actually suffered more casualties in training accidents during the Second World War than at the hands of the enemy. Modern artillery is also a double-edged weapon of support, the practice of firing indirect or from map references rather than at visible targets, resulting in its shells falling sometimes. British infantrymen affect to believe always among friendly instead of enemy soldiers, and the guns themselves, even more than was the case in Mercer's day, are apparelled to their servants. Prematures, the explosion of the shell in the barrel instead of beyond it, are, though rare, certain to kill the crew. Mine-laying and, even more so, mine-lifting are procedures which kill sappers, who are also very much at risk when arranging demolitions, and there are a variety of other ways in which military engineers can harm its practitioners. The officer who detonated the great mine under Spanbroek-Molen in June 1917 was electrocuted by a shock from the triggering mechanism. But it is probably the mechanization of armies which has done most to increase the accident figures. Young men are regarded by insurance companies as the worst class of risk, and wars put thousands of young men in charge of powerful vehicles on unsupervised roads fraught with hazards. Collisions, skids, petrol fires, ditchings, overturnings are commonplace on maneuvers. In real warfare they are yet more frequent, so much so that, during quiet weeks in the Vietnam campaign, traffic accidents often killed more American soldiers than did the Viet Cong. Some attempts have been made to calculate the proportion of accidental deaths to all death in battle. Attempts they remain, but the evidence is unarguably demonstrative of a very high level of accidental death in warfare, running in the British Army at about 1/5 of battle deaths in the Crimean War, 1/7 in the Boer War, and of a considerable and rising proportion of such accidents being suffered in and as a result of battle itself. Technical difficulty. The mechanization of war which underlies the rising accident rate might be thought to have had, as another indirect result, a marked complication of the soldier's role. If we are pursuing our mountaineering analogy, developments in that field would also lead us to the same conclusion, for the extreme climber must be master, not only of traditional rope work and balance and grip holds, but of cramponing, piton, and bolt placement and recovery, ice screwing, prusicking, and the hanging of etriers. At that point the analogy must fail. However, for a while the mountaineer necessarily remains an all-rounder. The modern soldier is increasingly a specialist. Indeed, to flatter its humblest members, the American Army has largely replaced the title private by that of specialist. Yet it is a name with little substance, for, though it imputes to its holder a delicate expertise, he very often possesses no more than is necessary to perform the very simple function which the continuing division of labor within armies has left him. Feeding a belt of ammunition into a machine gun, turning the dials of a wireless set, pulling the trigger of an automatic weapon. It would be perverse to suggest that the modern frontline soldier is less skilled than the musketeer or cannoneer at Waterloo. For it was the purpose of the drill each of them was taught to make him an automaton, and that the modern soldier is not. And it is certainly the case that the man behind the specialist, the armorer, radio mechanic, gunnery, computer operator, helicopter pilot, practices skills of an order of difficulty beyond the comprehension of most soldiers outside this century. Nevertheless, it can be argued, and argued forcibly, that the archer at Agincourt exercised a greater range and depth of skill than the modern rifleman, and the mounted men-at-arms even more so. Archery, épée, and horsemanship are athletic feats, demanding poise, timing, and judgment which few modern military functions require, and which correspondingly few soldiers, stronger and healthier though the majority certainly are than the soldiers of the age of edged weapons, can emulate. The inhuman face of war. Warfare in the age of edged weapons required yet another vanished military quality, perhaps even more crucial to skill at arms than agility or good reflexes, a sort of empathy with one's adversary, lending the ability to anticipate his actions and forestall his blows, combined with the physical brazenness which would allow a man to look a stranger in the face and strike to fell him without provocation or compunction. Prize fighters, of course, possess this quality, whether learned or inherited, and by reason of that fact alone, have for the common man an intense, almost zoological fascination. For direct face-to-face knockdown and drag-out violence is something which modern, middle-class Western man encounters rarely, if at all, in his everyday life. Yet, despite popular enthusiasm for prize fighting and fashionable encomiums of the social value of violence, to the contrary, it may be doubted whether its disappearance has left an aching void in Western man's pattern of desires. Killing people, qua killing and qua people, is not an activity which seems to carry widespread approval. It is not only in India that public executioners form a despised and outcast tribe. Even in pre-revolutionary France, the profession has become narrowly hereditary. The family Sanson practiced it for 7 generations, and executioners who lacked a family refuge were lodged in abominable hovels, did not dare to enter the towns except to do their work, and even then had to be given an escort for safety's sake. In 20th century England, the appointment was, until its abolition, also monopolized by a single family, the Parapoints. By the account of one of them against strong competition, though, by his own admission, competition from the lowest sort of person. Killing on the scaffold and killing on the battlefield are, of course, markedly dissimilar activities. Yet, for all the elaborate explanations used by civilized societies to exculpate the soldier who kills in battle from taint of personal guilt or social disapproval, that he undergoes the same risk of death as his opponent, that he kills in order to overcome a greater evil than killing. It is worthy of note that the one sort of frontline soldier who has some choice over whether he will kill or not, the officer, has, throughout the period at which we have been looking, consistently and steadily withdrawn himself from the act itself. This withdrawal is symbolized, in a way we have already seen, by the increasingly emblematic weapons which officers have carried at the beginning of the 18th century when the pike was losing its battlefield utility, a sort of miniature pike, at the beginning of the 19th century when the sword was going out of use, an ornamental sword, at the end of the 19th century when the machine gun had asserted its dominance, a pistol, usually kept holstered. During the First World War, often no lethal weapon at all, just a walking stick, and this impression of a distancing of the officer from the infliction of death is reinforced by reading the citations which are written to explain and endorse the award of high decorations for bravery. Those written for soldiers lay stress on their success at killing. Lance Corporal courageously worked his way around the flank of the machine gun, which was holding up the advance, and then charged it, firing his carbine from the hip, so accounting for 6 of the enemy. Citation writers, flinching from kill, deal largely in account for, dispatch, dispose of. On the other hand, those written for officers minimize their direct responsibility for killing and emphasize their powers of inspiration and organization when all about are losing their heads. In the metaphorical sense, nothing so nasty as decapitation ever creeps into a citation. Captain Blank, taking command at a difficult moment of the battle, quickly rallied his men and, without regard for his own safety, led them back over the open to the position they had earlier been forced to leave. To be fair to the citation writers, however, their subject matter is to a certain extent determined for them, since soldiers on the whole are given medals for killing and officers for doing other things. But that merely shifts responsibility for recognizing approved conduct back one step, from the writer of the citation to the one who awards the medal. We could, no doubt, push this regression some way farther back again. It would ultimately come to rest against the movable obstacle of the military value system, of which one major tenet would seem to be officers do not kill, or killing is not gentlemanly. Killing, nonetheless, was once a highly officer-like activity when practiced between equals and with a strict regard for the rules. Gronow, the guardsman with such illuminating memories of Waterloo, was a notable duelist. Wellington himself dueled in one party to the last major duel fought on British soil. In 1852 was a Colonel Romilly. Indeed, professional extinction could follow a refusal to duel when honor required it, quite far into the 19th century, to return, moreover, to a much earlier moment in military time. That of Agincourt is to encounter a world in which killing, or if not killing then certainly fighting, was the only gentlemanly activity. How and why has come about this progressive deprecation of the central act of warfare by its directing class, throughout a period when, as we have seen, the amount of killing attempted and achieved on the battlefield has increased from century to century? The answer is almost certainly comprehended in the question. For killing to be gentlemanly, it must take place between gentlemen. The rules of dueling were, indeed, specific on that point, and the laws of chivalry, though less exigent and exclusive, were equally insistent that the only feats of arms worth the name were those conducted between men of gentle birth, either 1-to-1 or in nearly, ideally in exactly, matched numbers. But every trend in warfare since the end of the Middle Ages has been to make personal encounters on the battlefield between men of equal social status more and more difficult to arrange. Drill, the most important military innovation of the 16th century, requiring that a man stay where put instead of wandering about looking for a worthy adversary, and smoke, the most obtrusive side effect of musketry, making such a search improbably successful, and such encounters, even if possible of arrangement, less and less representable as fair fight. For fair fight requires equality of skill, but firearms reduce skill at arms to an irrelevance. It was for this that the knight principally condemned them. The sword stroke, practiced 1,000 times, polished and refined and measured to pass unerringly beneath an opponent's parry, was beaten flat by a musket shot. The musketeer, militarily speaking, was as good or better than the men at arms, and, when drilled and mustered and properly led, the superior of any number of horsemen. Given that was so, the gently born began during the 15th and 16th centuries, reluctantly and with many a backward glance, though less reluctantly in southern than in northern Europe, to abandon the excitements of single combat for the routines of drill and the duties of leadership, realizing that, if they did not, they risked surrendering their social along with the military station to the mercenary chieftains, whose mastery of the new warfare was so irritatingly complete. Yet in doing so, they accelerated, of course, the trend of which they were so resentful. Knightly warfare was probably already nearly a century out of date by the time of Agincourt. Crécy, prefiguring its course and results in almost every respect. The passion for single combat had kept it alive, none the less, and in so doing had held in check many of those military innovations and inventions which were, when unleashed, to make Renaissance and post-Renaissance battles yet more costly than those of chivalry had been. Morally, therefore, the late medieval resistance of the gently born to military change had exerted a beneficial restraint. The echoes of the rearguard action they fought can be heard sounding through the din of the battles of the Gunpowder Age, and they reverberate still. But the distaste for mere killing which those echoes have communicated to the officer class of Western Europe, and a class officers remain in several real senses, is of course a great deal less important for the rest of us than the facts before which the well-bred professional recoils. Battle, always unpleasant for a minority of the participants, has increasingly become an intolerable experience for the majority. What has been happening is perhaps best described as an exaggerated social and cultural divergence from normality. Battle is always an abnormality, but in violent and technically primitive societies, the facts of battle come as less of a shock to those who first face them, and leave presumably less of a scar than they do in ordered, technically developed states. This is not to say that a medieval soldier would adapt better to life on a modern battlefield than would a contemporary. To say that would be nonsense, if only because the noise level, for which nothing in his experience would have prepared him, would of itself probably suffice to disorient and disarm him. But it is to say that, reared in a rural world where disputes between neighbors humble and great were common and commonly settled by violence, practiced, if not in the use of weapons themselves, then certainly in that of everyday tools which closely resemble them, accustomed to the company of horses and knowing their virtues and vices intimately, he would not have found in a battle of his own day, not at least until the killing began, and unless in the remarkably display of color and dress in which the chroniclers took such pleasure, anything greatly to shock or surprise him. There was, in short, considerable congruence between the civil and military facts of medieval life, and a minimum, admittedly a very substantial minimum, of divergence between them on the battlefield. Today, in the late 20th century, there exists also a considerable congruence between the technology of civilian and military life. Armored vehicles have their own counterparts in agriculture and earth-moving machinery. Trucks are trucks, whether bringing detergent to the supermarket or taking troops to the front. Wireless keeps one au courant from minute to minute, whether in the battle or a slit trench. Civil aircraft are as noisy as military. The quality, though not the volume of battlefield noise, is made familiar by the showing of war films, and this is to mention only artifacts, or their side effects, with which the general population has an everyday acquaintance. Men and women employed in continuous process industries are made indirectly familiar with many more modern battlefield phenomena. They are to a considerable degree inured to very high constant noise levels and to emission of intense light. They work in proximity to dangerous machinery and chemicals, including poison gases, and they are involved in high speed automatic processes stamping, turning, reaming, cutting, molding, the pouring of molten metals and plastics, which require perfectly timed human cooperation and imitate in many respects the actions of modern weapon systems, such as automated artillery pieces, self-loading tank guns, machine guns, flamethrowers, rocket dischargers, and the like. Modern industry, moreover, teaches its work people. Through the same lessons are learned by almost all citizens, first in school and later as the administrators of the state's bureaucracy, habits of order, obedience, and uniform behavior, which the embryo arms of the 16th century could not expect to find in any of their doltish recruits, though they rightfully recognized their position to be essential to the new warfare and devoted a lengthy and brutal effort to their inculcation. If to this preconditioning for battle we add the undoubted power which nationalist and ideological feeling exerts in opposition to the human instincts for self-preservation, we ought to conclude that 20th century man is potentially a better soldier than he of any other age. Yet that seems to me an improbable conclusion. In the first place, the climate of family, school, and cultural life, for all the respect we accord to the military virtues, without so naming them, has in the aftermath of 2 world wars become suffused with a deep antipathy to violence and to conflict. The abolition of capital punishment in almost all Western countries is but the most striking example of this distaste. With it belongs the gradual elimination of corporal punishment from education, the right to conscientious objection now conceded even by those states, like France, which have always castigated it as unsocial, the pursuit of economic and political cooperation between nations at the expense even of a partial surrender of sovereignty and a spreading belief in the attainability of a social millennium without passage through the fires of class warfare. It is important, of course, not to make too much of this climate. Moods are contrapuntal, so that the quietism of the dropout is matched by the insurrectionary beliefs of the parlor revolutionary. Moods are also fickle, and the very absurdity of much of the propaganda of social pacifism is calculated to hurry forward a turn of the tide. We ought, therefore, to be prepared for a dialectical swing away from fraternalism back towards the doctrines of self-reliance and self-defense, quota quae quote, of which the Israelis and the Palestinians are each purveying a highly exportable version. Yet were such a swing to complete its travel, I very much doubt whether the thereby changed outlook of Western youth would fit them for service on the battlefield of the future. For, despite the congruence of civilian and military technology, which is such an arresting feature of the modern world, where motor cars mimic missiles and machine tools, machine guns, in a realization of a futurist fantasy, the divergence between the facts of everyday and of battlefield existence is not only greater than ever before, but is widening year by year. What are the indicas of this divergence? First among them is what one must call, it is not an agreeable word, the impersonalization of battle. Its progress is something we can chart without too much difficulty. Medieval soldiers not only saw their opponents at very close hand, the high-born among them indeed were very often acquainted with one another, but fought them face to face. The rhythm of the fighting and its duration were in consequence dictated by human limitations. A man gained ground on his opponent, scored a hit, felt his sword arm tire, knew that he must win in the next 5 minutes or be done for, and pari passu, the same rhythms imposed themselves on his opponent. Because medieval armies were small, and battles were often fought without either side holding men in reserve, These rhythms determined the length of combat, and because the power of weapons was not very much greater than the muscle power of those who wielded them, the wounds inflicted were little different from the wounds of everyday life, those suffered in the field or workshop, to be judged at a glance trifling, disabling, or fatal. In brief, the terror and brutality of battles could yet be comprehended on a human timescale and in a human way. This close relationship to everyday life was emphasized, as at Agincourt, by the opportunity offered for local civilians to take part. There it was an ad hoc raid on the baggage park by the peasantry of the district, under the leadership of their lord, which provoked Henry's order to massacre the prisoners, and his soldiers' reluctance to carry out those orders, whatever their mixture of motives, is further evidence of the mediated inhumanity of medieval battle. The preservation of the lives of prisoners, even if of wealthy knights rather than poor archers, was an important diminution of the frightfulness of war, and one tending to set a rule for the general good. The lot of the prisoner on the battlefield of the Gunpowder Age benefited from the generalization of the principle of ransom, once armies had become properly regularized, and the care and exchange of prisoners legally regulated. Soldiers of any rank, as we saw at Waterloo, could safely offer their surrender in the expectation that it would be accepted without their suffering, hurt, or indignity, though it was probably safer, as we all saw, to offer surrender to soldiers of one's own sort, infantry to infantry, for example, interspecific surrender, infantry to cavalry, seeming occasionally to provoke interspecific acts of cruelty. The face-to-faceness of combat, still one of its marked characteristics despite the increasing range of weapons, could also work to mediate its violence. And it is interesting that, harden their hearts though they might at the spectacle of suffering among their fellow men, soldiers were much touched by the suffering of the horses, which they were reluctant to kill even to put out of their misery. Yet gunpowder weapons were already to a marked degree more impersonal than those of the age of edged weapons. The wearing of uniforms, however variegated, however splendid, diminished the individual identity of the combatants, which it has been one of the principal functions of medieval panoply to emphasize. So too did the imposition of a rigid chain of command, which robbed subordinates of that independence by which the headstrong noblemen had always set such store. While the new insistence on drill reduced the individual soldier's status to that of a mechanical unit in the order of battle, battle itself, because of these inbuilt mechanisms, steadily acquired throughout the passage of the Gunpowder Age a mechanical dynamic of its own. The action of the artillery, firing systematically over several hundred yards at blocks of human beings when the gunners perceived only as differently colored masses, being sufficient of itself to keep a battle in progress whether or not the armies were in intimate confrontation. For all that, gunpowder battles, fought during the daylight hours of a single series of 24 at short ranges over the span of a few fields, whose farmers might watch the carnage from the safety of a neighboring hilltop or wood. The forest of Soignes was crammed with peasants from the Waterloo district during the battle, calculating the cost of the damage to their crops against the income which the windfalls of war would leave them, were events which belonged demonstrably to the world of men. Of the battles of the 20th century, that is something of which it was increasingly difficult to say. If that is, the sensations of the combatants are accorded the weight they deserve, for what almost all of the soldiers of the First World War and many of the Second, even from the victor armies, testify to is their sense of littleness, almost of nothingness, of their abandonment in a physical wilderness, dominated by vast impersonal forces, from which even such normalities as the passage of time had been eliminated. The dimensions of the battlefield, completely depopulated of civilians and extending far beyond the boundaries of the individual's perception, the events supervening upon it, endless artillery bombardments, sudden and shatteringly powerful aerial bombings, mass eruptions of armored vehicles, reduced his subjective role, objectively vital though it was, to that of a mere victim, and a victim too was what he risked becoming, even if he took or had forced upon him the decision to stop fighting and give himself up as a prisoner. For men, rarely coming face to face, seen by each other, if at all, only as indistinguishable figures in shapeless and monotone uniforms, generally lacked the means to communicate such intentions to each other. A shout of surrender from the darkness of a dugout was too often an invitation to receive a grenade, the wave of an arm from the hatch of a disabled vehicle the signal to unleash a burst of automatic fire. Killing the crews of stopped or burning tanks as they bailed out was normal practice among Second World War infantrymen. It must be counted one of the particular cruelties of modern warfare that, by inducing even in the fit and willing soldier a sense of his unimportance, it encouraged his treating the lives of disarmed or demoralized opponents as equally unimportant. At another level, the fostering infliction of deliberate cruelty marks a second major divergence between the facts of everyday and battlefield existence in the 20th century. Weapons have never been kind to human flesh, but the directing principle behind their design was usually not been that of maximizing the pain and damage they can cause. Before the invention of explosives, the limits of muscle power in itself constrained their hurtfulness. But even for some time thereafter, moral inhibitions, fueled by a sense of the unfairness of adding mechanical and chemical increments to man's power to hurt his brother, served to restrain deliberate barbarities of design. Some of these inhibitions against the use of poison gas and explosive bullets were codified and given international force by the Hague Convention of 1899. But the rise of thing-killing, as opposed to man-killing weapons, heavy artillery is an example, which by their side effects inflicted gross suffering and disfigurement invalidated these restraints. As a result, restraints were cast to the winds, and it is now a desired effect of many man-killing weapons that they inflict wounds as terrible and terrifying as possible. The Claymore mine, for instance, is filled with metal cubes. How far have we come from Thomas Puckle's famous gun, firing round bullets against Christians and square against infidels? The cluster bomb with jagged metal fragments, in both cases because that shape of projectile tears and fractures more extensively than a smooth-bodied one. The Heat and Hesh rounds, fired by anti-tank guns, are designed to fill the interior of armored vehicles with showers of metal splinters or streams of molten metal, so disabling the tank by killing its crew. And napalm, disliked for ethical reasons even by many tough-minded professional soldiers, contains an ingredient which increases the adhesion of the burning petrol to human skin surfaces. Military surgeons, so successful over the past century in resuscitating wounded soldiers and repairing wounds of growing severity, have thus now to meet the challenge of wounding agents deliberately conceived to defeat their skills. These intentional inhumanities seem worthy of notice because the societies which sanction them are dedicated in their treatment of human beings away from the battlefield to standards of consideration, compassion even, higher than those adopted by any others of which we have knowledge. The modern Western state accepts the responsibility not merely to protect the individual's lives and property, traditionally the legal minima, but to educate and heal him, support him in old age and when unemployed, and increasingly to guarantee his prosperity. Might the modern conscript not well think, at first acquaintance with the weapons the state foist on him, that its humanitarian code is evidence either of a nauseating hypocrisy or of a psychotic inability to connect actions with their results? The third, and in its fashion perhaps most disturbing divergence between life on and off the battlefield, is seen in the role coercion plays in keeping men in the killing zone. Coercion is a word to which the vocabulary of democracy gives grudgingly house room. The liberal state likes to believe that it works by consent and persuasion, that compulsion is a method of dealing with citizens to which only the lower forms of polity have resort. The truth is, of course, that all armies, whether of democracies or dictatorships, depend on the coercive principle. Most armies have a code of law and punishment separate from that administered by the civil courts. that it is a vital element in making battles work, and that it is one which the character of modern warfare invests with more, not less, force. Remembering the extent of the direct coercion applied at Waterloo, the positioning of cavalry behind the rear rank of unwilling infantry battalions so that they should not be able to break and run, the flogging forward of soldiers by their officers, the firing at friendly cavalry by infantry disgusted at their cowardice, that later point might seem a difficult one to sustain. But the fact that coercion was indeed direct and personal on the gunpowder battlefield, that the officer who flogged too hard risked a bullet should he turn his back, and sometimes got it, as did Colonel Bremen from one of his own grenadiers, whom he had hit with his cane during the Battle of Saratoga. That bullying cavalry who crowded infantry too close might feel their bayonets, set limits to its scope. It is the function of the impersonality of modern war that the soldier is coerced, certainly at times by people whom he can identify, but more frequently, more continuously, and more harshly by vast, unlocalized forces against which he may rail, but at which he cannot strike back, and to which he must ultimately submit. The fire which nails him to the ground or drives him beneath it, the great distance which yawns between him and safety, the onward progression of a vehicle, advance or retreat which carries him with it willy-nilly. The dynamic of modern battle impels more effectively than any system of discipline of which Frederick the Great could have dreamt. The abolition of battle. Impersonality, coercion, deliberate cruelty, all deployed on a rising scale, make the fitness of modern man to sustain the stress of battle increasingly doubtful, and this seems to me true even though modern man is too vague a figure around whom to frame so general a statement. We must take account of the undoubted willingness of some men at all times to risk, even apparently to enjoy, extreme danger and arbitrary cruelty. Though the life required an oath of submission to be burnt with fire, shackled with chains, whipped with rods, and killed with steel. Uri, unansiri, uborai, foroko nasari. There were volunteers as well as slaves in the ranks of the gladiators, and not all of them social refugees. Mark Antony's brother Lucius fought as a gladiator in Asia Minor. In our own times, almost all professional soldiers can recall acquaintance with men for whom the terrors of battle seem to have little meaning. Corporal Lofty King, Brigadier Dunford Slatter, wrote of one of his commandos, was very tall and very tough. He was a hard fellow in many ways and very hard with his men. He didn't give a damn if he knocked a man down. Sometimes I told him he was being too rough. Lofty would say, "It's good for them, Colonel. It won't do them any harm." He would mean it and believe it. He genuinely enjoyed fighting and looked happiest, indeed inspired in battle. In the field he was kinder to his men, as if the fighting were a kind of release for him. Lofty King is a significant figure whose outlines can be discerned in the thick of the fighting on many battlefields. Legros Lenforcer of the Great Gate at Hougoumont belongs to the type, and whose power to impose his superior will on his comrades lends support to one's suspicion that, after all, battle is to the strong, that without the presence of the Lofty Kings and the Legros, most battlefields would empty of soldiers at the firing of the first salvos, and that one of the subtlest forms of coercion practiced in armies is the patronage by the grandees in the upper ranks of their bully boy opposites in the lower. Battle is also to the young. Its physical ordeals, discomfort, loss of sleep, hunger, thirst, burdens, are not only better borne by men under 30, so too are its terrors, its anxieties, its separations, its bereavements, and young men are also moved more deeply than older men by the moral consolations with which battle compensates the soldier. It would be foolish to deny that there are compensations for its cruelties, the thrill of comradeship, the excitements of the chase, the exhilarations of surprise, deception, and the ruse de guerre, the exulsions of success, the sheer fun of prankish irresponsibility. Lord Robbins, the eminent economist, describes in his autobiography how, during the few days of mobile warfare he experienced as a young gunner officer on the Western Front, he was brought wholly unexpectedly to realize by his release from the grim routines of the trenches what an absorbing and enjoyable activity battle could be, and why in times past it had fulfilled the energies and imaginations of the European upper class to the exclusion of almost all else. Yet the prospect of battle, excepting perhaps the first battle of a war or a green unit's first blooding, seems always to alarm men's anxieties, however young and vigorous they be, rather than excite their anticipation. Hence the drinking, which seems an inseparable part both of preparation for battle and of combat itself. Alcohol, as we know, depresses the self-protective reflexes, and so induces the appearance and feeling of courage. Other drugs reproduce this effect, notably marijuana, the American Army's widespread addiction to it in Vietnam, deeply troubling though it was to the conscience of the nation, may therefore be seen if not as a natural, certainly as a time-honored response to the uncertainties with which battle racks the soldiers. The choice of that particular army, moreover, had local precedents. The pirates of the South China Sea traditionally dosed themselves with marijuana before attacking European ships. Hence, too, it would seem, the stirring or rekindling of a desire for spiritual fortification before battle. In primitive warfare, the enactment of tribal rites is often absolutely vital preliminary to any planned encounter with the enemy, and in the Christian armies of the High Middle Ages, like Henry's at Agincourt, the saying of Mass in the hearings of confessions. Henry heard Mass 3 times in succession, seems to have been regarded in much the same light, though these sacraments were of course offered by the priest strictly as means to a personal renewal of grace, not of corporate inspiration. Indeed, wherever the light of religion had aught died out from armies, men seemed to hunger for its consolations on the eve of action. In the Kitchener armies waiting for July 1st to dawn, it was not enough to have written home, made one's will, and shaken hands with friends. To have been to church was for many a necessary capstone of the preliminaries. Rum was welcome to stifle the flutters of panic as the seconds ticked down to 0, but was not accepted, as it seems to have been by Wellington's impious majority, as provision enough against the imminence of combat. Whether or not, however, it is with religious observance that the men preface their entry to battle, or with some solemn military ritual, like Napoleon's grand review of his troops on the morning of Waterloo, or the proclamation of an order of the day, or some other ceremony, it does seem that something, a pause, a moment of recollection, a summoning of force, a dedicatory act, a prayer of intercession, must be added to the purely material and administrative dispositions made by an army if men are to commit themselves to battle with the stoutest hearts they can find. That is perhaps why a battle which begins with one army surprising another does not always yield the success it theoretically ought. For unless an army has inwardly hardened itself for the shock, it will not stand to be beaten. Whatever the process of inward hardening, the shock nevertheless will shake some men's resolution to breaking. It is unfortunately impossible to represent this pattern of breakdown in any comparative style, for it is only since the beginning of the century that armies have been taught to accept that courage and cowardice are not alternative free choices that come to every man, overriding all emotional stress, that a man cannot simply choose which he prefers, and be courageous if he is told he must. Running away, refusing to fight, getting the shakes, or going inert were all stigmatized less than 70 years ago as displays of cowardice, and it was only with the greatest difficulty that even an army so comparatively humane in spirit as the British was led to think differently. Men whose symptoms we can now recognize as though of true psychiatric breakdown were shot for desertion during the first 2 years of the First World War, and the fear of the death penalty yielded a multitude of hysterical conversion symptoms, by which men lose the use of limbs, speech, or sight rather than demonstrate straightforward displays of anxiety. The army eventually reconciled itself to the inescapable fact of the breakdown of so many of its soldiers by inventing the notion of shell shock, which suggested for it a single physical cause, and treated the soldiers so affected in what were called NYDN, not yet diagnosed nervous hospitals. But any statistics of the proportion of psychiatric casualties to all battle casualties for 1914 to 18 remain hidden. In the Second World War, however, the psychiatrists of the British, and to an even greater extent the American, medical corps were able to insist on a proper recognition and treatment of psychiatric cases, their hand being much strengthened by their success in teaching the armies how to identify among recruits those particularly suited for the specialist military functions it was increasingly necessary to fill, and those most likely to make no sort of soldier at all. As a result, we now have some reliable statistical material, and it reveals that, despite the system of rejection the psychiatrist instituted, psychiatric casualties at every stage of the war formed a significant percentage of all battle casualties, diagnosed as exhaustion cases in their simplest form and as neuropsychiatric in their more aggravated, depending on the type of battle, wrote one of the British Army's senior psychiatrists. 2% to 30% of all casualties may be psychiatric. His evidence revealed that, of all battle casualties, 10 to 15% were psychiatric during the active phase of the Battle of France in 1940, 10 to 20% during the first 10 days of the Normandy battle, and 20% during the two latter months, 7 to 10% in the Middle East in the middle of 1942, and 11% in the first 2 months of the Italian campaign. Many of these, perhaps as many as 90%, were eventually returned to some form of duty, more or less demanding, but even among those judged fit to be returned quickly to their fighting unit, figures varied from 70 to 56%. Some 5% of these broke down again in the same battle. Moreover, as time dragged on, almost all soldiers exposed to continuous or semi-continuous combat broke down. As the authors of the American official report Combat Exhaustion explain, there is no such thing as getting used to combat. Each moment of combat imposes a strain so great that men will break down in direct relation to the intensity and duration of their exposure. Psychiatric casualties are as inevitable as gunshot and shrapnel wounds in warfare. Most men were ineffective after 180 or even 140 days. The general consensus was that a man reached his peak of effectiveness in the first 90 days of combat, that after that his efficiency began to fall off, and that he became steadily less valuable thereafter until he was completely useless. The number of men on duty after 200 to 240 days of combat was small, and their value to their units negligible. The fighting of the Second World War, in short, led to an infantryman's breakdown in a little under a year. The indirect effect of these consequences of battle were many, but some of the most interesting were those felt and betrayed by the leaders of armies. Generals, since the end of the First World War, had become markedly sensitive to the disparity between the risks suffered by the men who framed the plans and those who carried them out. On earlier battlefields, that disparity had been small, if at all apparent. Wellington, indeed, was arguably at greater risk on the field of Waterloo than many of his subordinates, and at Agincourt Henry, though generalship and planning are concepts one can undoubtedly apply to medieval warfare, where the setting of an example was all deliberately courted risk throughout the battle. Hindenburg, Haig, Joffre, on the other hand, never smelt powder. Haig, for motives which he was adept at rationalizing, would not even visit his wounded. Their chateau generalship, a style which, to be fair, they inherited rather than created, caused deep, if unexpressed, offense to the generation of officers who, subalterns in 1914, were senior commanders by 1940, and stimulated them a new risk-sharing style of leadership, publicly justified for the closer control of the battle it permitted, at a moment when the proliferation of wireless sets made command from a chateau sensible, privately desired, one suspects, because it quelled a vicarious, anticipatory sense of guilt. Rommel's variant of the style was to command from the leading tank, Guderian's to roam his battlefields in an armored wireless truck, Montgomery's to inhabit a tactical headquarters within earshot of the fighting. Generals began also, in a reversal of that long established trend for officers to distance themselves from killing, to carry weapons. Patton habitually sported a pair of pearl-handled revolvers, Ridgway a pair of grenades, Bach a revolver, Wingate a rifle, and more of them, as Grant, eccentric as it was thought, had done, began to dress as private soldiers. Montgomery, Bradley, Stilwell are scarcely distinguishable in their uniforms from the humblest soldiers under their command. Perhaps because of these efforts to identify with their men, however, many generals seemed unable to reproduce that necessary resistance to stress, which so noticeably stamped the characters of an older generation of chiefs. Sorrow and anxiety spare only the rarest even among leaders. Wellington wept copiously after Waterloo. Frederick the Great had his surgeons bleed him during his battles to lower the tensions he felt, and poor Henry VI keened an endless discordant song throughout all the battles which his courtiers obliged him to attend. But the military code traditionally required composure, even at moments of personal agony, and it evoked it. Castelnau and Foch each continued to direct operations after receiving news of the death of their sons in the Battle of the Frontiers in 1914. Ludendorff to command despite the loss of both his cherished stepsons at the height of the First World War. During the Second World War, the code seemed unable to sustain its votaries. Incompetent generals always became casualties. That war broke competent generals also. Rommel, for all his daring do, experienced agonies from a nervous stomach, which twice took him away from the front at moments of crisis. Guderian was invalidated from Russia with heart failure. Reichenau suffered a stroke during the campaign. Ridgway had a severe blackout in September 1945 and was advised to retire. Mere hardness of character of the sort demonstrated by Zhukov or Model, rather than any particular strategic or tactical flair, increasingly became the principal military virtue as the Second World War dragged on. Other commanders who appeared to stand the strain did so only by cultivating a curious detachment from the conduct of the battle themselves. The three most admired generals of the British, American, and German armies, Alexander, Eisenhower, and Rundstedt, were each in their different ways not really generals at all, non-generals, almost anti-generals. Alexander, hell-raiser though he had been as a young officer, insisted on leaving control to his subordinates and confined himself to fostering good relations within his multinational army. So, to an even more marked degree, did Eisenhower, whose aura became eventually papal rather than military. Rundstedt, revered throughout the German regular officer corps as its last archetypical Prussian, refused to deal with detail or to look at small-scale maps, as if the fighting itself were distasteful to him, but spent his days reading detective stories and thrice resigned his command. But perhaps the most interesting, even if the best known and most overworked example of a general's reaction to stress of modern battle is Patton's chastisement of the psychoneurotic soldier in a Sicilian hospital. The publicized incident was in fact the second of two. In each case, he had expressed his anger that a coward should be treated in the same way in the same place as honorably, physically wounded soldiers. May we not understand this be-pistoled, risk-taking general's outburst as a transmuted expression of his disgust that he, who shared his soldiers' lot, sought them out in the front line to praise their courage, stood ready to sacrifice his life as readily as any, should have been repaid for identifying himself with them by behavior which questioned his sincerity, which silently accused him of not knowing the ultimate reality of the ordeal he asked his soldiers to undergo, and so made a mockery of his impression of the hero. Something of a concern not to be caught out in such a falsity, a refusal to frame orders whose detailed consequences he would not directly suffer, appeared to have underlain Alexander's curious aloofness from the mechanics of command. the chance to intervene directly at the very forward edge of the battlefield, at the height of the fighting, in almost instant response to summons, explains the contemporary general's enthusiasm for the helicopter. In a fashion Patton would generally have envied, the helicopter does carry the general back to the stance from which Wellington commanded, and returns to him the power to observe, to manage, to exhort, to maneuver, to look battle in the face. In the helicopter, the general has the impression of controlling the battle and shaping it to his ends, of remarking battle as a useful and decisive exercise of power. But is this a valid impression or only an illusion? For the helicopter does not only bring the general to battle, it brings also the air-mobile soldier, whose experience is one of an extraordinary divergence between the normality of comfortable barrack life and the terrors of the battlefield, to which, in under half an hour, he can be smoothly transported. The experience resembles, though in a heightened form, that of combat aircrew, in which it produces strains so uniform and intense that the number of operational missions they may fly has to be limited if they are not inevitably to crack. The air-mobile soldier, in his turn, is an element in a new sort of army, one mechanized and tracked and armored to a degree unmatched in any of the armored formations of the Second World War. Everything in all fighting units on both sides of the border on the Central Front in Germany is mechanized, including supply, maintenance, and bridging equipment, and most of it, including the artillery, is armored and tracked infantry, the infantry section of 10 men cocooned inside its armored personnel carrier. There lies the revolutionary difference between the armies of the 1970s and the 1940s. Armies on the move, whether in attack or defense, are trained to maneuver and expected to operate at 30 miles an hour, moving in dense waves across country, stopping only if so ordered or deposed, and seeking to overwhelm opposition by the weight of fire from their guns and their infantrymen's weapons. We lack a detailed picture of what an encounter between two such armies would be like in reality, and fortunately so, for it would be the preliminary to a firing of nuclear weapons. The Yom Kippur War between the Syrians, Egyptians, and Israelis nevertheless provides a few clues. The battle, to begin with, would be as noisy as any experienced in the First or Second World Wars, there being added to the constant crash of the projectiles of indirect fire weapons, field artillery, and rocket projectors, the explosion of mines, with which the future battlefield is to be liberally sown, and the cascading explosions of cluster bombs dropped from the air, a very great deal of mechanical clatter and whine, and the unmistakable periodic clang of high-energy rounds hitting tanks. The noise a solid block of tungsten makes on striking armor is highly distinctive, a high-pitched ringing clang, and although that note would not predominate over the future battlefield's cacophony, it would be the keynote for which the occupants of the armored vehicles listened, tolling as it would the disablement of a vehicle and extinction of its crew. Not all of its crew, perhaps, but, being dependent almost exclusively on their sense of hearing for knowledge of events outside their shell, the occupants of tanks and armored personnel carriers might be inclined to imagine so. The state of mind of these occupants exercises the leadership of modern armies very considerably. It has already been grasped that to enclose men in a confined and windowless armored box for long periods is to risk, among other effects, seriously disorienting them. It is therefore intended, when the next type of armored personnel carrier is built, to provide a quartz peephole for every passenger, so that he shall be able to maintain some picture, however fragmentary, of where he is being taken. It is also understood that soldiers cannot be cramped and congested for long periods without losing their efficiency, and the interior of the infantry carriers are, as tanks are already, to be padded and air-conditioned, provided with means to heat food and cool drinks. Yet one wonders whether all these measures will realize that fighting efficiency they are designed to assure. For what can they be but minor elevations of a further impersonalization of warfare, a greater alienation of the soldier from anything recognizably human or natural on the field of battle, a steeper reduction of his status so that of a mere adjunct to machinery, the software in the system? And while it is undoubtedly possible for picked men to sustain for short periods conditions of the sort which shut down armored warfare will impose, tank and air crews have consistently done so over the last 50 years, naval turret crews for more than a century. It is important to remember that depictions of future battle suppose all fighting soldiers, picked and unpicked, will be able to tolerate something analogous to the air crew environment for periods not of hours, but of many days and nights. The concept of continuous operations, which is proposed to conduct in an armored battle in Europe, and for which the most elaborate electronic night fighting equipment, infrared searchlights, image intensifiers, ground surveillance radars, and movement sensors, is provided to the armies, requires soldiers to remain continuously in action for periods of 100 or 150 hours. There is even talk of attempting to keep them awake for 80 hours at a stretch, using if necessary doses of one of the amphetamines as the agent. Ironic, if official condemnation of the private use of hallucinogens and tranquilizers in battle is to partner in official administration of stimulants. In practice, the Israelis and the Arabs, on whom night fighting equipment had been lavished, found themselves so exhausted at the end of the day-long battles of October 1973 that they relapsed gratefully into sleep as soon as darkness fell. But the NATO powers cannot count, as can all parties to the Palestinian problem, on having their war stopped by outside intervention whenever a defeat looms. Their armies therefore must train in all seriousness for the land battle in Central Europe, must learn to live for days in stifling gas masks and clammy radiation suit, which would have to be worn as precaution even during conventional operations, isolated inside their armored vehicles from sight or smell of the outside world, connected to it only by disembodied voices received there through their wireless sets, and able to form an impression of the events transpiring beyond their carapace, only from whatever fragments of fact higher authority vouchsafed to communicate. In all seriousness, requires to be qualified in the light of these circumstances. Train with high dedication would certainly be correct. Train with a firm conviction that the battle they practice is one likely to be fought seems much more doubtful. For all the initial advantages which the communist army's superiority in numbers gives them, their soldiers are not psychologically different from those on the other side, and we are faced now with a prospect of battle which, through the physical and nervous strain, the multiple stress pattern it will impose on the combatants, threatens to break them down whether or not they come into direct contact with the enemy. Allied military psychiatrists had learnt by the end of the Second World War that the very first hours of combat disable 10% of the fighting force. A major intensification of the strains which broke those men, such as that imposed by several days of continuous operations, such as that it might break the majority, and that decision would be brought about not by the direct confliction of death and wounds, but by the immersion of an army in a situation which would prove psychologically intolerable. Decision, as I began by saying, is a concept which military historians use in an ambiguous fashion. By decisive battle, they can mean simply a battle which has a result, which ends in the clear-cut victory of one side over the other, but by it also a battle whose result causes some real shift in the direction of human affairs far away from the battlefield, bringing about the downfall of a heretofore dominant power, setting the term to a hitherto irresistible tide of imperial expansion, toppling a political system, cutting short the career of a conquering hero by a curious function of his deformation professionnelle. The military historian's search for results is almost always directed at one or other of these two levels, at the immediate effect of the battle on the strength of the army and the mind of its commander, or else at its impact on the morale and resources of the war-waging power. Yet, as I have tried to argue, the most important, the really decisive effects of a battle are more immediate and impersonal than those belonging to these other categories. It is armies which fight battles, and armies which contain the men who, in any society, can and will and know how to fight. Battles, or more precisely defeats, are immediately decisive because they kill some of these men and dissuade the rest, for a longer or shorter period, from wanting to fight any more. As to the longer term consequences, where a preponderance of the fighting men are drawn from the governing stratum, as in a feudal army or a patrician militia, we should look for them first in the rearranged pattern of personalities which death, cowardice, or displays of prowess will have brought about, then in the mood and aspirations which an army will carry home with it. Where the warriors form a unique and expensive specialist group, as in the armies of dynastic and post-dynastic Europe, we should look elsewhere at the economic cost of the state's effort to reform from the urban crowd, or the rural peasantry whence the beaten army was drawn, a substitute for it. Add its political cost also, in terms of the concessions the tax-paying classes will wring in return for financing the rebuilding, and the demands for a guarantee of their privileges the military classes will present in competition, where the army is levied directly on the male youth of the country by general conscription, as in the liberal and not so liberal states of 20th century Europe and America. We should look far more widely and deeply. The very scale of the First and Second World Wars has determined that, look as we may, we cannot yet categorize all those results or chart their dimensions, but one at least denies contradiction, that the experience of violent and sudden death has been brought through battle into many, perhaps a majority of families, that fear of the suffering, arbitrary and accidental as well as deliberate and purposive, battle can cause to human societies is profound and almost universal, and that the usefulness of future battle is widely doubted. The young have already made their decision. They are increasingly unwilling to serve as conscripts in armies they see as ornamental. The militant young have taken that decision a stage farther. They will fight for the causes which they profess, not through the mechanisms of the state and its armed power, but where necessary, against them, by clandestine and guerrilla methods. It remains for armies to admit that the battles of the future will be fought in Never Never Land. While the great armored hosts face each other across the boundary between East and West, no soldier on either side will concede that he does not believe in the function for which he plans and trains. As long as states put weapons in their hands, they will show each other the iron face of war. But the suspicion grows that battle has already abolished itself.